If you want to go and take a call to
There he is on the screen.
It's on the next page, I think. So I'll make sure you advance.
We're ready whenever you are, Mr. Brownsburg.
All right.
Well, good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Today is February 9th, 2022, and I want to welcome everyone to the Finance Committee meeting of the Central Virginia Transportation Authority. I'm glad that each of you were able to join us today. It's good to see everyone here in the new year as well. Morning, good morning. Smiles on faces. It is warming up, it feels good. We've had some inclement weather in the past, obviously, but we have gotten through a little bit of that. And I'm looking forward to another awesome year here at the Central Virginia Transportation Authority. So thank everyone for joining me today. Before we get started, Ms. Firestone, would you please certify that we have a quorum?
Yes, sir. Chesterfield County, Mr. Carroll.
I'm here.
Hanover County, Vice Chair Peterson.
Here.
Henrico County, Mr. Thornton.
Here.
City of Richmond, Chair Stoney.
Here.
Commonwealth Transportation Board, Mr. Brown.
Here.
Thank you, Mr. Brown. That concludes the roll call, and we do have a quorum.
Ms. Firestone, thank you so much. We'll now move on to the rest of the agenda. Item 1 is the consideration of amendments to the action meeting agenda. I have no changes to the agenda. Are there any other changes to the agenda? Ms. Heater, I don't see Ms. Heater here. Mr. Parsons, any changes to the agenda we need to be aware of?
Mr. Chair, there may be a request to adjust old business item 6. It may not be prudent to request action at this time. So just for the board's consideration.
Members of the board?
What is the amendment to your?
I just wanted to let the committee know that it may be too soon to request action on item 6. Take it up when he
That's
gets.
not really an amendment, though.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, right.
It's just a matter of.
Just move, we'll move that. All right. So I see none or no changes to the agenda. We'll move on to item 2, the approval of the January 5 CVTA Finance Action, the minutes of the meeting. Do we have a motion to approve the January 5, 2022 Finance Committee meeting minutes? It's been seconded. It was moved, I'm sorry, second. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Ayes have it, the minutes are approved. We'll move on to now open comment, item 3, open public comment period. To the staff here at CVTA, are there any public comments that were sent in, or anyone who's with us this morning who wants to offer any public comment?
We have 2 attendees participating virtually, but neither have indicated that they wish to speak.
There are no indications of public comment. So we will move on to item 4, that's the chairman's report. As today is February, I wanted to take a moment to recognize this is the month in which we celebrate Black History Month. And as a Black man, I stand on the shoulders of giants and of heroes that have come before me, heroes and sheroes as well. And I would be remiss if I did not recognize that we have a living legend, I believe, in our midst. And that is Mr. Thornton, the chairman of the Central Virginia Transportation Authority. Mr. Thornton is the first Black man, Black individual voted to serve on the Board of Supervisors of the Henrico Board of Supervisors. I don't know how many years, Mr. Thornton, you've been in service.
Since 1996.
1996. And then this wasn't, he did not win on his first go-around as well. A couple tries before he became the first to be elected. But I was reading something, Mr. Thornton, and I think this is correct, and I dare say it's true about your role here with the authority as well, that you have been the conscience of Henrico County. And I dare say the conscience of this region, and you have brought that to bear here in the inaugural, in the inception of the Central Virginia Transportation Authority. So I want to just take a moment and recognize your service, not just to this authority, but your service to the region and to Henrico County's residents as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. All right, we'll move on to item 5. That was the conclusion of my report. We'll move on to the activities report. I'll hand it over to the staff, Mr. Parsons.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The item 5A is the financial activities and investment reports on page 7 of your packet. You will see the tax collections and allocations report as of December 31st. A couple of highlights: the total local distributions at the printing of this report were $35,163,578, and the regional fund ending balance at that same stage was $72,373,357. The following that on page 8 is the monthly investment report for December of 2021, with the pie chart there in the middle of the portfolio mix between local government investment pool and Virginia investment pool. At this point, if anybody on the committee has questions, we can certainly make those aware to the financial group and get those responses back to you.
Got a question. Why do we have a 3-month lag?
I was just commenting about that with Ms. Heater this morning. Do you have a explanation other than that's the state's MO?
If I'm not mistaken, it's a 60-day lag and a 90-day lag, and that's due to the collections. So local governments contribute. They have a window of time to be able to remit those collections to the state. The state then processes, it transfers, and then that's the process. We knew that coming in, so you might recall, even though the tax revenue was initiated in January and October, that first tranche of deposits didn't happen until 3 months later, and that's been the cycle going forward. Yes, so they are on
By
time.
the time it gets to us, it's 3 months after the.
That's right. They are on time, and they have been since last January consistent with the timing of deposits pursuant to the agreement that CVTA has with the state. So we haven't had any issues or delays. It's just what the flow is.
Okay.
Yep. Mr. Carroll.
Page 7, it says regional fund ending balance $72,373,357. That's from July 1, 2021 to when?
That's actually through the end of September with that 3-month lag. And I was remiss, on page 7A is the January report. So those numbers are updated through October.
Okay. Thank you. Any more questions for Mr. Parsons?
I do have Mr. Ure here with me as well as the TAC chair to provide an update
Mr.
on
Ure?
TAC activities.
Good morning. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Chad. So the CVTA Technical Advisory Committee last met on January 10th. We reviewed the status of the regional funding applications. The TAC will meet again next week, and we're anxiously awaiting the screening, scoring, ranking, and available funding for the regional project applications. So we're standing by to review that and provide recommendations to move forward through the Finance Committee and the full authority. Separately, there's a fall line working group that has been formed for all of the localities that are impacted directly by the fall line, as well as VDOT and other stakeholders. Purpose of that group is to look at making a funding allocation plan and a project delivery approach for the entirety of the fall line through the region. That group is starting to meet monthly. So we're, working diligently in the background to provide the best approach to deliver the Fall Line Trail as quickly, as efficiently as possible. So stay tuned for additional recommendations out of that group. That's the extent of my report, unless there's any questions.
Any questions for Mr. Ure? Seeing none, Mr. Parsons, you have anything further?
I do not.
All right, that is the conclusion of item 5. Now we'll move on to old business. Item 6 is the Finance Director's Working Group recommended CVTA debt policy. I assume there's some discussion from the Finance Director's Working Group, but Mr. Thornton, you had a recognition that you wanted to.
Yes, I wanted to, Mr. Chairman and fellow members, fellow commissioners, a young man who's gonna give this presentation, I wanted to at least give you some background for him. He's been with Enrico not as long as some of you have been. With your indulgence, please allow me to introduce Mr. Terrell Hughes, Director of Enrico County's Department of Public Works. Prior to his appointment with Enrico County, Mr. Hughes served the Virginia Department of Transportation, where he provided oversight of the department's STARS and multimodal programs and supported the administration of Virginia's Smart Scale Funding Prioritization Program. Prior to his service with VDOT, Mr. Hughes worked as an engineer and project manager for several private engineering and consulting firms. Since August of 2020, Mr. Hughes has overseen the design, construction, and maintenance of secondary roads in Enrico County, which is the third largest road network in Virginia with more than 3,500 lane miles and 159 traffic signals. His agency is also responsible for stormwater drainage, administration of public transit services, and enforcement of erosion and sedimentation laws and ordinances. Mr. Hughes earned a Bachelor of Science in Civil Engineering from Virginia Tech and is a registered professional engineer in the Commonwealth of Virginia. He has received a 2019 VDOT Commissioner's Award and is president of the Old Dominion section of the American Society of Highway Engineers. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Hughes.
Mr. Hughes, it sounds like you have the confidence of the members of the Board of Supervisors in Enrico County, it sounds like to me.
Sounds like. Thank you, Mr. Thornton, for the introduction.
Now, everybody doesn't get an introduction like that, I tell you that.
Hopefully I live up to the introduction.
Yes. Please proceed.
Okay.
No pressure at all.
No pressure. But Mr. Chair, thank you for having me. I have the honor to give you guys the update of our finance director's working group. And as Mr. Thornton kind of pointed out in the introduction, I'm not a finance director, but I guess I'm familiar with spending the money. I guess I'll say that with my role. So you can go to the next slide, Chet. So really, I'm going to report back. We had a number of meetings, and really staff was charged with coming up with some broad concepts on really what a multi-year capital plan, how it could be built. So really, this is just some general recommendations. We're not necessarily coming to you directly with a actual policy to adopt, but really some information to help inform a decision. And we provided, we've looked into a couple of the debt options, a couple of options from a debt standpoint or the pay-go. We've reviewed some of the policies of really the two peer authorities to CVTA, which would be Hampton Roads, HR TAC, and up in Northern Virginia, NVTA, those two authorities.
Darryl, Chip, could you adjust this so we can see the full screen?
Yes, sir. We're working on that.
Okay.
Minimize the cameras on the side, Janice.
Okay, I did that, but it's still showing.
It's on both, actually.
This one?
Technology.
There we go. Thank you.
All right, so anyways, like I said, this is really more of an overview and really a full set of, in looking at some of the financial policies that the other two authorities have adopted, you'd really want to work with an FA on a full set of policies just to nail that down. So this is really just more of a general overview. You can go to the next slide, Chet. So Some quick general observations. In looking at NVTA, they have used a hybrid model where they had bonded in 2014. They had a bond sale, but they also are largely using a pay-go model, and I think they're able to do that. Really, one of the key differences between CVTA and NVTA, 70% of their funds, and they do raise a significantly a higher amount than CVTA. But 70% of their funds do go into the regional pool. The other 30% is returned to local, where you're familiar, our model here with CVTA is 50% local, 35% regional, and then we have the GRTC component, which is unique. And then looking at the Hampton Roads model, they are largely bonded. They have a number of large projects that they're currently working with the state to deliver. So that's, and all 100% of their revenues goes towards projects, regional projects. So they don't necessarily have a dedicated local component, and there is no money is allowed to go to transit. So that there's a difference there. And from what I could see, a lot of their bonding really ties them up through 2057. So they've released a number of bond sales, but they're largely tied up for quite a bit of time with some of the investments. And they've made some really large investments. I think their bond amount is in the $3 billion range. So they have bonded quite a bit for the future. Now, one thing I will also point is funds from both of those authorities have successfully been used to leverage outside funding sources. So they've gone to the state with, as Mr. Thornton mentioned, the Smart Scale program, and maybe some other programs as well. They have used that additional regional funding to help leverage outside funding to bring in more money to those areas. So they're not necessarily fully funding those projects, but they're using the regional money to give them a leg up to get some of the other funding sources that are available to the state. Now, we did look at the pay-go model versus bonding, and there are some pros and cons to both. So if you look at the pay-go, it provides greater flexibility. You're looking at funding things on an annual basis. You're taking the funds that come in and trying to allocate that, and a spend plan can be put in place to put money to use. So if a project only needs 10% of its funding for a year, then you can, with a pay-go plan, you can allocate only 10% of the funding for that year, as opposed to getting all of the money at one time and not necessarily spending it. And then some of the cons are, projects you may have to stagger projects. You can't start them all at one time. So if they're all ready at one time, you can't stagger them all at one time. Depending on the amount you receive from a pay-go standpoint, you may not be able to, some of the bigger projects, you may have to be creative to get those to fit in. Now, from a bonding standpoint, some of the pros are it does provide funding for large projects. So if you have really large projects that exceed some of your multi-year allocations, the bonding can come into play to get some of those started. That's what we're seeing with the Hampton Roads model. And you can start multiple projects at one time, which is really what Northern Virginia used the bond for in 2014. They got a number of projects kick-started at the same time. Some of the cons, as we're seeing, just kind of talking with folks in the Hampton Roads area, you're tied up. So you're pretty much, that's the projects that you bond out, that money is now committed to debt service. So you're not as flexible in the future with your funding. And like I said, it can reduce some of your flexibility as things change in the future. So go to the next slide. So real quick, I'm not intending you all to digest this document, but VDOT, has a lot of documents out there that really just sort of outline the project development process. And the reason I'm bringing this up is in talking about spending, bonding, and projects, the readiness of a project now plays a big factor into when and why you would want to bond. So in the case of Northern Virginia, they had a lot of projects that were fully designed, had fully worked through a lot of the right-of-way, but just didn't have money for construction. So they were pretty much ready to go. They had already worked through environmental studies, a lot of the public outreach that has to happen. And that I think advised them that maybe it was the correct time to bond. And I think the same thing is true with some of the projects in the Hampton Roads area. A lot of the environmental work, right-of-way, some of the major efforts that are required prior to going to construction were undertaken. So like I said, that's really what I'm trying to highlight. So within the region, there's a lot of projects, that have yet to go through the project development process that's needed. I think that's what we're currently working through right now. As Todd mentioned with the fall line with the working group, they're trying to figure out how fast can they work through a lot of this. So some of the planning work has already been done. A lot of the legwork had been done as far as the alignments. But there's still quite a bit of work to do on the fall line in terms of acquiring right-of-way, acquiring easements, having 100% design plans, getting all of the environmental studies, maybe doing some of the public outreach that's necessary. So that's why I'm pointing this out. You can go to the next slide. That does play a factor into pay-go versus bonding. And that's why you can stagger projects as well, because all of those phases aren't going to necessarily happen at the same pace for every project. And I don't have all the details on this, but I worked with Chet just to get a general overview. I believe, in the next couple of months, you'll be seeing some of the projects and how they're scored. That'll be the time to go into depth on the projects. But Chet was able to provide some general observations on the regional applications that were received over the last over this last period. 37 applications were submitted, so 8 of the 9 localities were represented in this. The total cost of all of those requests was about $800 million. Or the total cost of the projects is over $1 billion. So there was some outside, or there is an expectation, I think, to leverage some outside funding for some of the projects. The average request was just under $22 million, which does skew a little bit towards the smaller side. But we also pulled up the median because we did have one outlier. The highest request was just under $400 million. That was by far the highest request. Most of the other requests were well under $50 million. So the median request is $7 million. So in general, most of the requests have been small, and it appears, just like I said, from my outside point of view, that a lot of the projects that are up for regional candidacy are looking to leverage some of the outside funding. And
Mr. Chairman, can I just ask a question?
Mr. Brown.
So we have not seen those applications yet, correct?
Yes, sir, this is Chad. That's correct.
So we don't have context as to what's in the pot, right? I mean, I guess, and because I appreciate this presentation, this piece of the presentation, but without context, it's hard to know what these numbers are really telling us. And so it would actually be helpful to know, what is the $396 million project versus what are some of the other items that are kind of being discussed here? Because I think as we think about our debt policy, we've had this discussion. It's a chicken and egg situation. Whether or not you want to use more debt and leverage the CVTA funding turns on what you want to accomplish. What do you want to do, right? And so the more you want to do, the more cash you need initially, so the more debt you may be willing to take, versus if we were to decide that we don't have anything really big that we want to do initially, then the pay-go option seems more appealing. So I guess it's hard to kind of think about this without some context as to what it is folks want to do. So I just wanted to just point that out. I didn't want it to go too far before I made that comment.
All right, Mr. Chair, Mr. Brown noted, and I think that's why we're not necessarily recommending a policy as more so just providing an overview for your information. We didn't feel it was the right time. We wanted to inform you of some of this. So, you may find at the end of this presentation, you may want to look at the applications first prior to deciding on a debt policy. So just a little bit more information on some of the regional applications so far. Chet was also able to provide just the top 7 asks. So the top 7 projects range from $23 million to the project that's just under $400 million. So as you can see quickly, the top 7 drops off in terms of asks. Just some quick facts. 3 of the projects are intended to be VDOT administered, 4 would be locally administered projects. Of the project type, 6 are highway or roadway projects, so not necessarily limited access highway, but in the category for scoring, these would be more roadway type projects. 1 was considered a bridge project, which there's a scoring category for bridges as well. So 6 out of the 7 have a supporting planning study. So some work has been done from a planning standpoint. But preliminary engineering, which typically is the first phase of the project development where you get into more detailed design. One project started preliminary engineering in 2018, so that project is probably a little bit ahead of the others. The other 4 projects are expecting to start preliminary engineering here this year in 2022, so they have not started preliminary engineering yet. And the 2 of the other projects are expecting to start preliminary engineering in the year 2025. So like I said, I just kind of point that out as far as just where projects are in the terms of readiness, since preliminary engineering is the first step of a fairly of multiple steps that have to happen before a project were to be constructed. And then, like I said, 3 out of the 7 have other committed funding, so that just points back to the leveraging and readiness. You can go next. So one other thing, just wanted to point out, just in terms of funding opportunities, since that also should factor into some decisions for PAYGO versus bonding. The Commonwealth Transportation Board that Mr. Brown sits on was, I think, their last meeting. They were presented some updates from the Deputy Secretary of Transportation and staff at VDOT on some of the impacts of the federal spending bill, the federal infrastructure bill that came in, and there are some increases in some of the pots of money. So without knowing specifically about the projects, there is an increase or an uplift in available smart scale funding over the next 6 years to the tune of $750 million. The State of Good Repair program, which tends to handle, I think, maintenance bridges, will see an uplift of $660 million. The interstate program that the state has will see an uplift of $540 million. RSTP and CMAQ, they're administered here at the MPO. We'll see uplifts of 137 million and 37 million. And I will point out, all of this money is not dedicated to Richmond District or the Richmond region or the RTPO Plan RVA. And then there are also multiple new federal programs, which we're on our end with my job, we're tracking, trying to figure out what the process is for applying for some of these federal programs. A lot of those programs haven't been set up, but we're seeing things with, programs that specifically support transit, specifically support bridges, highway connections, to the tune of $1 to $2 billion a year for national awards. So there are opportunities, and in our experience working with the federal grant process, it is helpful if you do have some outside money or some leveraged money, and have something that's a little bit more ready prior to coming to the federal government for funding. So that's just one thing. But yeah, there's a lot of opportunities to potentially leverage outside funding. So you can go to the next slide. In terms of bonding potential, to just quickly, just in looking at bond versus PAYGO, I think this graphic, it just shows one example of what a 10% bond could do. These are just, we made some general assumptions on this. And it also really shows what, if the flexible 10% amount, about 6 million would go to debt, if you bonded this year, for example, 6 million would go to debt service. The other 90 million would be available on a bond, and this would be paid over a 20-year period. There would still be something like 57 million for PAYGO. So this kind of illustrates roughly how much money could potentially be available in PAYGO. If you add the 57 with the 6, that's about how much PAYGO you have. You could do the math and scale up your bonding amounts depending on what you're looking at. But like I said, this is just some of the bond potential that you can consider when you look at if you look at the applications and try to figure out how you're going to fit projects in and which ones are ready. But I will note. Well, you can go to the next slide. Just the committee, we made some recommendations that just based on what we're seeing with the initial round of applications and looking at NVTA versus HR TAC, some of our recommendations is the CVTA could benefit more from a flexible, largely PAYGO, maybe some type of hybrid model, as opposed to the Hampton Roads model where they've bonded it all out. Like I said, just in talking with some of the other localities, they lack some of the flexibility to move forward with some of their other priorities now. But they did have some major regional needs. I will point out that they're very happy with being addressed. Project size, it tends to be a little bit smaller here. So what it looks like with kind of what annual amounts are available, it does look like some type of spend plan could work with the staff, the CVTA staff, so to say, or a financial advisor, or even with VDOT to help arrange some kind of spending program. That's typically what the state does to help stagger multiple projects in with their annual allotments. The project timelines also are a factor in this flexible approach. It appears there really aren't a whole lot of shovel-ready projects that at least came forward with the region, so some work is needed on the front end of quite a bit of projects to get them to the point where they can actually be constructed. So that plays into the recommendation. And then the regional spend plan that I mentioned earlier could help optimize funds and put the money to work. So rather than allocate $50 million to a project where it's going to take 6 years to spend all the $50 million, you could spend 10%, you could match the spending to match the funding or allocation to when the spending is needed to put the CVTA funding to work. Now, the other note that we had is CVTA regional funding can be leveraged to improve competitiveness for outside funding. So we've, like I said, we've had multiple follow-up meetings with like the Smart Scale team, and I think some common advice that has come around it came to the MPO. A lot of localities that have met is if you leverage outside funding, if you can buy down your costs, it can help your project score better and compete better. So that there may be an opportunity with the regional funding pot to leverage to bring in more statewide dollars to the Richmond region. To make the projects more competitive. And the same could be true for some of the federal programs. Like I said, we're still trying to figure out some of the details on those, but a buy down and some of the asks on some of those programs may help those projects compete at the national level a lot better as well. And the other thing I will note, not knowing the actual list, but some of the regional projects may be great candidates for some of the federal programs. So I know personally, working for Henrico County, we're looking at some of the different federal programs and trying to see, okay, maybe this project might fit into this one or that one. And there may be, around the region, there may be maybe some of those programs may be specifically tailor-made to some of the projects that the region is looking to pursue. So those are just some of our general recommendations. We don't actually, like I said, we don't have a debt policy that we're actually recommending, but wanted to give you some information and context. And to Mr. Brown's suggestion, it may be helpful to actually look at that project list in the next couple of months to kind of help weigh in on a decision on what your debt policy should be. So with that, you can go to the next slide. I'll take any follow-up questions, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Carroll.
Thank you for the presentation. And this may not be a question for you, maybe a question for Mr. Mann or somebody else, but in the presentation, one of the things you talked about is that the Hampton Road Transportation Authority is pretty much maxed out their bonding capacity through 2057, I think is what you said in the presentation.
They have allocations tied to 2057. So they have some of their debt services will come off in 2042, 2047.
But for now, they're tied up, which means that them competing again for state dollars is probably limited because they've already, do we know this? They've already basically designated their funds and have already competed for their projects. Do we know that one way or another? The reason I think it's important is if maybe Carlos can answer that question.
Yeah, I could actually speak to that. So yes, with regard to projects where they will be leveraging their dollars. However, I can give you a case in point, because they have done so much in the way of major improvements on, for example, 64, the benefit that when other 64 projects, interstate exchanges, and those projects come into the Smart Scale process, because the benefits will be leveraged so significantly off of the investments already made, they score better. So for example, there's about $90 million that from the interstate program that could have gone anywhere in the state on related to 6495, and it went to Hampton Roads because after all the other investments made on 64 to make these additional interchange investments scored incredibly well because you're leveraging off of the infrastructure that's already been been invested in. So they're more competitive to do add-on projects at the lower cost, where they don't have the ability to buy it down as much because the benefits are outsized because of the prior investments, if that makes sense.
It does, thank you. I just think it's important for us to look at what the competitors are gonna be doing. We determine what we're gonna do, because that's who we're gonna be competing against for dollars. And I think it's important for us to be aware of, how significant their ask is compared to ours, and how it would affect our ability to be able to leverage against our funds towards the state dollars as well. So thank you.
My comment only is that, so some of our peers, as you stated, Mr. Hughes, is no one's solely using just PAYGO, correct?
Yeah, not that we could see.
Yeah, so there's either a hybrid or a largely, a approach that is focused largely on bonding, correct?
Of the two peers that we.
Yeah. And they mean, at the end of the day, they do have a head start on us, we're some years behind, but as you stated earlier, just knowing the landscape of the Commonwealth, some of the regions, particularly Hampton Roads, their project list or their project focus has been, I think about the crossing over the HRPT crossing and whatnot, it's cost a lot of money. And so it's kind of hard to have that sort of cash right on hand. So you have to leverage your dollars to get a project like that done. So as you stated, it's going to depend upon what our project list looks like and what sort of vision we have for the region in terms of projects moving forward and how to strategically get those projects accomplished in a period of time. And my preference is that we don't make a decision until we know what we're going to be doing. Better idea, at least.
Mr. Chair, just a quick point on, I take your comment to heart. Remember that the other two authorities are set up differently in terms of their funding streams. So Hampton Roads is 100% regional. So they're organized to look at those big projects. Here we're focused just as much on local control and local priorities as we are regional. So that might influence the decision-making process as well.
Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, Peterson.
A couple questions that you may, Mr. Hughes, you might be able to help with. NVTA and HR TAC, what is their debt services? Obviously, they're different, but it's a percentage of their collections.
Mr. Chair, Mr. Peterson, so I think right now Hampton Roads they're approaching almost all of it. I believe. I'm not going to say it's 100%.
They don't have. They're not. Do they have each of the authorities? I'm sure have reserves that they maintain. Do you know what the percentage those reserves are of their annual collections?
I do not off the top, but we can get that.
I think these are important things when we're setting a debt policy. We need to have a level of reserve to make sure we have a solid bond rating. And what that is going to be directly related to also how much we take out in bond service. And so it would be helpful to know what kind of reserves they have relative to their collections, and because we need to set reserves relative to our regional collections to make sure that we do have bond ratings that are going to get us good bond rates. Mr. Brown's comments on the projects, I think, are very critical. I mean, if we're talking 37 projects were submitted, 7 were ranked at the top. What we can bond, you can bond the money and put something in all 7 projects, but they may not, any of them rank high enough to compete. Whereas if we bond and concentrate on 1 or 2 projects, we might be able to be competitive. So there's a balancing act, I think, that we're going to have to look at to get the most for our money. But at the same time, I think we've got to be very careful not to put ourselves in a position of not having a good, sound financial basis for how we operate.
Mr. Chair.
Mr. Carroll.
I would ask staff to bring forward back to the committee the presentations that were given early on in the CVTA, both from the Northern Virginia Transportation Authority and the Hampton Roads Transportation Authority. My recollection of Hampton Roads was that their funding finances coming in on a yearly basis were about $200 million a year. And I think when they presented, they also said they were in the process of having roughly $5.6 billion in projects that they were currently funding. And so I believe embedded into those presentations, I think the information on what Mr. Peterson's requesting exists as what, how much they put in reserves and those type of things. So if we can retrieve those two presentations, I think it should answer those questions.
Yeah, and Mr. Carroll, I'm actually looking at the May 21 presentation that Davenport provided, and just to give a couple stats, the MVTA has $231 million outstanding in bonds. No, sorry, $231 million annual pledged revenue, $60 million in bonds outstanding on 20-year amortization, with the 2.0 times additional bonds test. They do have reserve requirements. The minimum liquidity of $120 million is a part of their policy. HR TAC, again, they're AA bonds. They have $211 million annual pledged revenues. So that's what they expect to collect. Bonds outstanding of $1.5 billion, amortizations 40 years. Again, 2 times additional bonds test. They have no reserve requirements, but they have $100 million minimum liquidity policy. Those presentations are in our, we received those back in May of 21. Just for
close. I was off by 11 million.
Yeah. Yeah. The one thing I would just kind of lay on the lines of the mind of the committee here about the kind of the genesis and the idea for the CVTA. To Mr. Parsons' prior comment, the CVTA structure is different than the other two because of the regional collaboration and its formation. There is a large set aside for locally ministered and managed projects where this body, the CVTA body itself, has no engagement. So the 35% that we're talking about here was designed to do big regional things, right? The things that one would think no one locality ought bear alone because the benefit would be material to the region. What I would suggest is, and you know, I think I have a bias towards the bonding, and I'll just say that because the regional fund was not designed or thought of to do small things, and it was not thought of to do small things one at a time because of the fact, and we've had this conversation around the Fall Line Trail, because there are I forget if it's 7 or 9 different jurisdictions that are in play here. We would not want there to be a scenario where 1 or 2 jurisdictions saw a significant benefit or investment from the regional fund, and other jurisdictions had to wait until some subsequent time, you know, in the next 6-year plan to see a benefit. So I would just ask everyone to think about that and to think, what are the big things, right? We talk about Hampton Roads and why they decided to go big and go and bond was because many of the projects they had on their list were 20, 30 year long projects that would have taken 20 or 30 years more if they had been incremental in their approach. And so I would just ask that we remember that if we are being incrementalists at the regional level, while we also have the local dollars that we legislatively agreed to be managed locally, then I think there would be some that would question why do we need this, right? The Fall Line Trail is a great example of doing something big as a region that we would not do independently as individual jurisdictions. So that I just remind everybody of that.
Thank you, Mr. Brown. Mr. Thornton.
Mr. Chairman, as we reflect over the comments that we've heard and all of this, one of the things that we must end up in is, I hear the word and I see the whole idea of competition. So we're talking about Northern Virginia, Hampton Roads, all of that. Now, as someone said earlier, they had a jump start on us. So what we have to keep in mind, CVTA members, is that these three have to be customized. So although we have our own goals, we can't do exactly what other ones do. But what we can do is make sure we do that foundation, listen to each other, and knowing what our fabric is. When I say our fabric is, those localities, that's very important for us. To make sure that we do the best planning. So whichever direction we decide to go, but we got to make sure we are competitive. And my whole point is to be competitive, you got to think it out, and you can't necessarily follow another group, but we can maybe see some things, take the good points from them. So I just hope that we'll follow that line of thinking. And in conclusion, because people are going to have a choice in the future, say, well, I want to go to a progressive area. And we want one of those progressive areas to be the CVTA area. So I just want us to keep that in mind. All this is competition.
I was gonna ask, a question to staff. So, I just want your counsel on this is, how do you all see us getting to a position on, our approach when it comes to debt policy?
I think at this point, the finance committee and the full authority has leaned on the finance director's working group for advice and counsel. And I think out of anybody in the region, they are probably the best situated to provide advice on next steps. As you recall, there were interviews for financial advisors. That is another very valid avenue that the authority could take. I think we had two very viable candidates that were finalists, and a recommendation was made to move forward with that. That's still on the table as far as staff is concerned. I think the other point that Mr. Hughes made, which I think is worth repeating, is that we're at a time right now where there are generous federal dollars that are available and will be available in the near future through federal action that has taken place the last few months and year. And if we are able to position projects in this region to be shovel ready, there's going to be a lot of opportunity to go after that leveraged amounts, and that may be something that, at least in the near term, CVTA may be wanting to consider to be put in a better position to compete at that level.
Mr. Chairman, what time frame are we talking about?
For the federal dollars, or just in
The
general?
whole scenario that you're talking about, that we need to, by what time do we need to have a policy in place? And like I said, we don't even know the projects yet. I mean, we know the 37.
Yes.
I would appreciate if we all were given the 37 projects with the rankings.
Yes,
before our next meeting.
Yeah,
to look at.
thank you, Mr. Peterson. That as some background, the staff right now is scoring those projects. We're almost complete. Out of the 37 applications, we believe that 31 are actually eligible based on the guidelines that the authority adopted. So we expect to have the scoring complete by the TAC meeting.
The top 7.
No, that was just, for the purposes of this presentation, those 7 projects were given as an example. So we think that there are 31 valid applications that could be considered for regional funds. So we are prepared to provide that update to the TAC when they meet next Monday. And at that point, it'll be.
We'll have the full ranking.
Yes, sir.
And Mr. Parson, I've identified, I guess you could say, 3 outstanding, as we position the chicken and the eggs, 3 outstanding issues for this committee and for the body at large as well. We have an open call for an executive director, correct? We have recommendations for a financial advisor. And we have coming recommendations on a debt policy. So I think we have to decide how we position, in order to get to the debt policy question, which is a policy question, we have to decide which of these sequence, which order do we want to move in with those three outstanding items. Is that fair to say? And I feel like I'm just gonna call it like I see it here. We've kind of been spinning our wheels just a little bit, trying to get some sound footing on where we should go on these decisions, but it's gonna come down to us making a decision on one of these three items and putting ourselves in sequence to get this stuff done.
Mr. Chair,
Mr. Peterson.
I think you're absolutely right, and I think a very important thing is this financial advisor. Is getting them up. We've made the recommendation. I don't think we've actually taken it to the full body.
Yeah, I'm not.
So I'm recommending that we make that recommendation to the full body, because I think having them on board is really gonna help us do a much better job of setting this debt policy.
Yeah.
Yes, I'll do that, that we recommend it to the full authority.
There is a motion to recommend the financial advisor that was already recommended to the finance committee to the full board. Is there a second?
Second.
So a motion has been seconded, Ms. Firestone, or any discussion?
Again, this is to bring to the full CVTA for
approval.
consideration. Probably won't make this month's meeting, but probably the next one. Is that right?
Ms. Cedar, Ms. Parsons, Mr. Parsons.
We could make it this month, I believe.
Okay.
Any further discussion? Ms. Firestone.
Chesterfield County, Mr. Carroll.
Aye.
Hanover County, Vice Chair Peterson.
Aye.
Henrico County, Mr. Thornton.
Aye.
City of Richmond, Chair Stoney.
Aye.
And Commonwealth Transportation Board, Mr. Brown.
Aye.
Thank you, Mr. Brown. That concludes the roll call for that item.
Thank you, Ms. Firestone.
Mr. Chair, in reference to your comments, I think also coming up in this next full meeting, we actually made a recommendation at the last finance committee meeting to move forward with a presentation to the full committee on options for staffing the executive director's position. So that should be coming up, I believe, at our next meeting. Is that right?
Thanks.
We have the same material, yeah, I think that our understanding from last finance committee was that the same material that you heard last month would be included, and I think certainly if there's been developments with the HR roundtable, we can incorporate that in.
Yeah, we're gonna bring it forward to the full committee for consideration.
Yeah, we have the content, I think if there's been other discussions among the HR roundtable, we would just look for that input so that we know what to include in the packet.
Okay, great.
Mr. Thornton.
Mr. Chairman, I hope we all heard very clearly too, in the direction that we're going, process. There's some funding that's available, so we got to make sure we optimize process in this whole thing that we're doing. Very important. I just want to add it as an addendum, what you said.
And I think that's why, I'm grateful for, I appreciate that we've taken some action today to recommend to the full body, because I think you are absolutely correct, Mr. Thorne, that we got dollars on the table, at least in our future, and so we gotta at least get our processes in place, and that means we gotta check off some of these boxes right here on these three outstanding items. And we should probably do that sooner rather than later.
So Mr. Chairman, just to give some context to the conversation about timing. So the one thing that we know about the dollars, many of the federal dollars that are coming from the infrastructure bill will flow through the state's traditional funding programs on that schedule. Here is the dilemma, or here's where the sense of urgency comes in, and Mr. Hughes knows these schedules very well, is most programs run on a biannual schedule. And so, for example, SmartSco applications, I believe, are coming in, Mr. Hughes, this March, next month, for this next round. They'll go through the scoring process. Scores will be released in January, and the funding scenario will be released next January, and then we will approve that next round of funding in June of 2023. So essentially, any program or any projects that we would have potentially had to put into the, I guess it's round 6 of Smart Scale, where these new federal dollars will be allocated. We're kind of behind the 8 ball in one context, right? The projects can be submitted by the region and the TPO, but we don't have matching dollars, right? So whereas there are projects that we know we could score well and be more competitive if we were to go into the process pledging, X% of the project's cost to buy it down, we may not be, or I think we probably won't be in a position to do that for this round, where the new dollars will be allocated, because we don't yet have a allocation score or schedule. Mr. Hughes or Chad, if I'm thinking about any of this wrong, please correct me.
Yeah, Mr. Hughes. Oh, yeah, Mr. Chair, Mr. Brown, I guess to your point, and very good point, I think one thing that the TAC had foresight on was to see that coming. A lot of the folks on the TAC are very active in the application cycle, and a lot of the applications that went in December, I believe that was the reason why the December schedule was set, was so that the projects that would be considered for Smart Scale, knowing the pre-application window was going to close in April, would potentially be able to be considered for regional funding. So that kind of goes into some of my thoughts too on the asks were maybe a little lower, because I think there was some thought and foresight from multiple localities to leverage the funds for this upcoming Smart Scale round. So there may be time, depending on how quickly, I guess, the board, the region acts, to catch this round of Smart Scale on that end. And then as far as the federal schedules, those are the ones that come through the state, but as far as the federal application cycles, to be determined.
That's right.
Yeah, so we're still trying to figure out what the criteria and schedules are.
Communication from the White House on a daily basis. I don't know what's going on.
Yeah. So just want to follow up. So Mr. Hughes, so to that point, because again, I know, because this is where I had a sense of urgency as well, kind of going back to when we were going to get the scores. So help me understand a sequence where we can help our regional applications. At what point would this body have to make a funding decision such that can be considered in the round 6 of Smart Scale? What's our back end deadline to do that, so that the applications can be updated and scored appropriately?
So, Mr. Chair, if you don't mind, I'm going to have Mr.
Please
address that.
Yeah,
Mr. Brown, great questions, and that's actually on the agenda for this morning to touch on that a little bit. But we are looking at, so for round 5, the pre-applications open in March. The full applications are due by the end of August.
Okay,
So
all right.
we have a schedule that TAC has set up with the Finance Committee as well as the full authority that has been adopted, so that we are able to provide advice to the member jurisdictions about possible regional projects that could be selected by the authority. And those member jurisdictions are also able to leverage local CVTA dollars, RSTP and CMAQ dollars, and other sources to help in those Smart Scale applications. We will not have that ready for the pre-apps, but they are under consideration, and all the member jurisdictions know which projects they've applied for CVTA dollars. So it's kind of a known quantity, but we'll be ready to have something teed up for the authority to take action on, so that when the full applications for Smart Scale are due this summer, you'll have everything in your quiver ready to help make your decisions.
Okay, very good.
Awesome. Folks, I think we've exhausted a lot, but good discussion on item 6. I think it's time to move on to item 7. Fair to say? Oh, go ahead, Mr. Gregory.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Before we,
Before we
the window was about to close on you.
and I don't want to overstep my bounds. I'm just a lawyer. I'm not a policy decider like you all are. But there was talk about sort of competition with the other regions and talk of big projects and wanting to do big things. And it occurred to me that the CVTA is in competition, in real competition with the other regions for funding, but you also could be in collaboration with them for big projects. I mean, Mr. Hughes talked about the ability of HR TAC to leverage the funding for their 64 widening projects due to the equity earned based upon prior investments. In order to, and I may be channeling Ms. Page here, but it could, I don't know if this is feasible or not, but conceivably the CVTA could partner with HR TAC on that big project to complete the widening of 64, and that could be a collaborative project between the regional funding authorities, possibly. I don't know, but it just occurred to me that that might be something. In addition to the competition, it could be an opportunity for collaboration with those big things. Anyway, I don't want to get out of my.
We love opportunity. Without a doubt.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Gregory. Move on to item 7 now, the FY 2021 annual certification and FY 2023 expenditure plans. Mr. Parsons.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just as a bit of background, we have teed up, the staff has a number of things that are required to take place on a regular basis by the authority. One is we need to have an annual certification from each member jurisdiction as well as GRTC that the funds that were expected to be used in the year for transportation purposes were actually used for those purposes. So we have distributed all of the necessary forms and authorizations for everyone who is a member of the CVTA to respond and certify that those funds were spent correctly. And this is a point where item 7 is an update and a request for action on a couple items. Mr. Gregory, I defer to you. Item A and B are in the packet on page 10 and deal with GRTC's certification and quarterly reporting. This is the first, I think, full report that we've gotten in. The action requested is to recommend that the authority, full authority, accept this resolution. And I believe those could probably be taken together in terms of the annual report and the quarterly reporting for September 30th, 2021. And then I will have an additional item under 7C that I can provide a general update on the member jurisdictions, similar actions.
So we can take both the quarterly report and the certification report in a block. Is that what you're saying?
That's my recommendation.
All right, is there a motion? Any questions? Okay.
If I may,
Please,
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, the instrument for the certification is on page 10, as Mr. Parson mentioned. That we created that as a guide for the local jurisdictions and for GRTC, the members of the authority, to provide the certification called for under the statute. So that's the mechanism, and then they provide backup information, documentation to support that resolution, that certification. So that's on the back of page 10, page 11. That's their finance report, and then they have their financial report from Brown Edwards beginning on page 12. So that's the supporting documentation, and the resolution provides the certification. So those, if satisfactory, and from my view, I believe this satisfies the legal requirement. If it satisfies your requirement for adequate financial information, then that would suffice. So GRTC is a good one to use as the first step because they're ready to go. The jurisdiction members are working on theirs, but they have the same guidance to provide the resolution / certification, and that will be forthcoming. Thank you.
Mr. Carroll.
Am I right in that this would be a motion to forward this to the full committee for consideration?
Yes.
And if so, then I would make that motion to forward this to the full committee for consideration.
There's a motion on the floor. Is there a second?
I will second that, Mr. Chairman, based on the fact that I do not have the intelligence to read all this stuff, but the financial people in Hanover County have said this is pretty well done.
And gave their seal of approval?
They did.
Okay, good.
Does that motion include a recommendation for approval, just to be clear?
Yes. I think that's what you said.
I will say yes.
Thank you.
There's a recommendation for approval of the two items that are in a block right here. It has been seconded. Any further discussion? Ms. Fyerson.
Thank you. Chesterfield County, Mr. Carroll.
Aye.
Hanover County, Vice Chair Peterson.
Aye.
Henrico County, Mr. Thornton.
Aye.
City of Richmond, Chair Stoney.
Aye.
Commonwealth Transportation Board, Mr. Brown.
Aye.
Thank you. That concludes the roll call for that item.
Mr. Parsons, you had item C in.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just as an update, we expect to have similar requested action for you next month regarding each of the 9 member jurisdictions in terms of their annual certification and quarterly reporting. I believe it will be through February 1st at this point. And at this point, we have had a response from roughly half of the jurisdictions. And I think the major item here is that the certification, the annual certification is requiring action and signature by CAO, CEO, and it just takes time. So we expect to have that for you next month.
Understood. Thank you, Mr. Parsons. Well, Mr. Parsons, item 8 also, the regional funding fiscal year 23 to 26 is also an item you are scheduled to present on.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much. Item 8A is on page 67 in your packet. This, I believe, is a 1-page form. It's a spreadsheet that provides an updated projection on the VDOT revenue forecasts. This is updated as of December of 2021 and has been vetted by the financial group that is advising the authority. We have, let's see, the last, if you can look at the right-hand side, the last column there, it's labeled adjusted forecast as of January of 21. That's broken down by fiscal year. And the purpose of putting this in front of you is to look at years 23 through 26 so that we have a foundation for these regional funding applications. What we've been talking about this morning, we want to understand what the revenues are expected to be so that decisions can be made on which projects to fund. So this is all going to funnel back through the TAC, but this is establishing our baseline. If you look at FY 23 to 26, the total amount is shown as $278.1 million. That's expected to, that's forecast to be available for the regional fund. And at this point, we would, the action requested is to, using this best available information, recommend that the authority approve the funding projections for FY 23 to 26 so that we have that baseline expected revenue to base funding decisions on.
On the paper, Mr. Chair, the far right corner, where it says regional revenue contribution by jurisdiction millions, can't see that number because it's apparently was too large for the box.
The total there, yes, sir.
Well, what was that? I think you just said it. What was that number?
Well, we're just looking at 23 to 26 for this requested action, but the total number there for 22 through 28 is 485.3. I'm sorry, that was cut off.
Any further questions? Is there an item, an action you need on this, Mr. Parsons?
Yes, sir. The requested action is listed in the agenda is to recommend authority approval of the funding projections for FY 23 to 26 of our 6-year plan. And again, that amount was $278.1 million.
So moved.
It's been a motion, has it been second?
I'll second. I have a question on the motion.
Mr. Carroll.
This would be a motion to forward this to the full CVTA for consideration, correct?
Correct.
Yep.
With approval.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep, there's a motion to recommend to the full authority the approval of funding projections for fiscal year 2023 to 2026 of a 6-year plan. And it's been seconded.
Mr. Chairman, is there a reason we're not, we've obviously projected through 2028. Is there a reason we're not asking for?
Yes, the reason is more practical than anything. The legislation requires us to have a 6-year approach to funding regional projects. So we started FY 21 and 22 with the fall line commitments. This will take us through that full first 6-year period. Those projections may change next year, so we didn't want to commit to anything past that point.
All right, we have a motion, we have a second, it's been seconded. Any further discussion? Ms. Firestone.
Thank you. Chesterfield County, Mr. Carroll.
Aye.
Hanover County, Vice Chair Peterson.
Aye.
Henrico County, Mr. Thornton.
Aye.
City of Richmond, Chair Stoney.
Aye.
And Commonwealth Transportation Board, Mr. Brown.
Mr. Brown had to depart.
Oh, he did, okay, thank you. That concludes roll call for that item.
All right, Mr. Parsons?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Item 8B is kind of a look ahead to the culmination of the efforts that are being discussed right now. We have now a recommended action to approve our funding projections, and the TAC is prepared to consider the regional project applications this month. This is all positioning the authority to hold a public hearing at its April meeting to approve a regional funding scenario. Mr. Hughes mentioned it briefly in his presentation. At some point, we're going to need to get to the point where there's preliminary engineering, right-of-way acquisition, construction, all the other components of the plan. And at this public hearing, there will be an opportunity to look at that funding scenario broken out by year in terms of which projects can move forward and how all that will be sequenced. That is what staff is bringing today, is to recommend that the authority authorize that public hearing on the draft funding scenario through FY26 to be held at its meeting on April 29th, 2022. Additional to the request is to advertise a 15-day public comment period from April 13th until the 28th to allow the public to review the draft funding scenario and provide comments back, so that it is all those comments are in front of the authority at its public hearing and meeting on April 29th.
Thank you, Mr. Parsons. Are there any questions?
Yes, sir. Is
Mr.
this being overly optimistic to be able to do this by that time frame? Based on the.
Spoken like
on
a
the
man
fact
who's been
that-
in government for a while.
I would defer to Mr. Ure as the TAC chair, but we're fairly confident that we have been drilling this schedule into everyone's minds so that we can meet these deadlines. Again, as Mr. Brown stated earlier, this is all so we can position for smart scale.
I just
So we
want to
do
make sure
have,
that we have an opportunity to review these things before it just comes up, and I don't want to be reviewing it with the public for the first time.
yes, sir. We expect that this will be on the agenda for at least the next 2 finance committee meetings, as well as the TAC, and we also have an additional authority meeting in March that there will be an opportunity to bring more information to the full group.
Any further questions?
Mr. Chair. If we just recommended to move forward to the full committee, as we did in 8A, the projections and a recommendation or approval, then I would think that probably when that comes before the full committee, then a motion could be made at that point to set the public hearing. I don't necessarily think that it requires a motion from the finance committee to do that. I think that the full committee can make that motion if they accept the approval. I think that we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves to assume that the full committee is going to actually approve it. I think that a motion made after the full committee, here's the recommendations under 8A would solve that problem, but that's just my 2 cents on that. I'll defer to legal counsel if they have an opinion.
Yeah, I was gonna ask Mr. Gregory whether or not you had any opinions on Mr. Carroll's comments.
I think they're valid and good. I don't think it hurts for the finance committee to recommend to the full board that they take action to authorize and schedule the public hearing. I don't think it's necessarily putting the cart before the horse, if you will. I mean, you can do both things sequentially.
Okay.
But if you're recommending it,
So recommendation, not a requirement.
right, it's a recommendation but a recommendation from a committee of the body carries a little bit more weight than standing on its own or as a recommendation from staff. So you might take that into consideration.
What I would say then is we could make a motion to recommend to the full authority to set a public hearing on April the 29th at our committee meeting, dependent upon the approval by the full authority on the recommendations made in 8A.
So you're, essentially, all you're adding is dependent upon,
Right.
yes.
And the public hearing couldn't happen without the prior approval anyway, so certainly
Right.
linking them that way makes sense.
Yep.
So fair to say is a recommendation to the authority to authorize the public hearing dependent upon. Yeah. Yes, okay.
I mean, because if they vote no, then we're not gonna have a
No
hearing.
public hearing.
So,
That's right.
All right, so is that your motion, Mr. Carroll?
yes.
All right, there's been a motion. Is there a second?
I'll say.
So a motion and a second. Are there any comments, any discussion? Seeing none, Ms. Fyerson.
Chesterfield County, Mr. Carroll.
Aye.
Hanover County, Vice Chair Peterson.
Aye.
Henrico County, Mr. Thornton.
Aye.
And City of Richmond, Chair Stoney.
Aye.
Thank you. That concludes the roll call for that item.
Mr. Parsons, anything further?
Yes, sir. Thank you.
All right, item 9 is the future meeting schedule and topics. I think we discussed that thoroughly earlier in the meeting. We do have some outstanding items that we need to complete. We took a step today, and I think there's some further steps we need to take to meet some of the milestones that Mr. Hughes spoke about earlier and that we discussed earlier as well. So glad to see that we are on the forward path, and I think everyone, whether virtually or here, for contributing to the forward motion that we're moving in right now. So that's not just the members of this committee, but also to the staff as well. So the next meeting, any further comments from anyone else? The next meeting is March 9th, 2022. Is there a motion to adjourn? So moved. We are adjourned. Thank you.